Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, Rita, for those beautiful opening words to ground our time together today. Indeed, may there be peace. We really wish we could be with all of you in person and be together on Holy Hill at this time. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that even though we are virtualized, that the Graduate Theological Union sits on unceded territory of the Ohlone people, Shoshone of Pichin territory, with the unceded villages of Lishan in the East Bay. So we want to begin by acknowledging that. Our first session is a large plenary divided into two thematic groups, and I will be introducing each of those sections and the respective speakers one after another, and then we will move into the two plenary sessions that will follow one another. Our first session is entitled Imagining Planetary Vitality. And our first speaker is my fellow conference co-organizer, Dr. Rita Sherma, who is director of the Mira and A.J. Shingle Center for Dharma Studies at the Graduate Theological Union. Rita has written many important contributions to the study of Hindu religion and Hindu theology at the American Academy of Religion and elsewhere. Among her recent books are Contemplative Studies in Hinduism, Meditation, Devotion, Prayer, and Worship in 2020. And her title of the talk she will be presenting is Sentience and Sensitivity, the Self-Awareness of Plants. Our second speaker is Dr. Whitney Bauman from Florida International University, where he is an associate professor of religious studies. Whitney has published widely in the field of religion and ecology, including recently with our former GTU colleague, Kevin O'Brien, Environmental Ethics and Uncertainty, Tackling Wicked Problems from Routledge, 2019. He's also an alum of our program. It's always great to have Whitney back with the GTU community. And Whitney's talk is entitled Developing a Critical Planetary Romanticism, CPR for the Earth. Our third speaker in the first plenary session is myself. I'm an associate professor of American Studies, Religion and Literature at the GTU, and my talk is entitled Playing, Not Praying for the Planet, Art, Imaginaries, and the Anthropocene. Our fourth speaker in the first plenary session is Dr. Bron Taylor from the University of Florida, who needs no introduction to many of us here because Dr. Taylor has been so instrumental for the study of religion, nature, and culture. He's a founding member of the International Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture, and the attendant journal to that, and also the seminal Encyclopedia of Nature and Religion that is on many of our shelves. The title of Dr. Taylor's talk is Kinship Through the Senses, Arts, and Sciences. That will be our first session. Our second plenary session is entitled The Arc of Justice. Our first speaker for that session will be Dr. Valerie Miles-Tribble, who is an associate professor of ministerial leadership and practical theology here at the GTU. Dr. Miles-Tribble has published widely in fields pertaining to justice theology and to social justice and theology, and it's her more recent book, Black Lives Matter Times, Urgency for Action. Change Ancient Church and Black Lives Matter Times, Urgency for Action, that is being much discussed in various circles. We're delighted Dr. Miles-Tribble can be here today. Her title talk is The Great Revolution. Our second speaker in the Arc of Justice plenary session is Dr. John Grimm, who is a senior lecturer and scholar at Yale University, and of course, the co-founder for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology that has been so instrumental for conversations about religion and the environmental humanities since that institution's inception, which he co-founded with Mary Evelyn Tucker. And among his many publications include Indigenous Traditions and Ecology, The Interbeing of Cosmology and Community from Harvard University Press. Dr. Grimm's talk is entitled Indigenous Humanities and the Narratives of a Viable Future. And finally, last but not least, rounding off our plenary session in the Arc of Justice is Dr. Cynthia Molobida, who is an associate professor at the Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary and the Church Divinity School of the Pacific here at the GTU. And among her many contributions to the field of environmental ethics and religion is her award-winning book, Resisting Structural Evil, Love as an Ecological Economic Vocation, from Fortress Press. The title of Dr. Moe-Lobeda's talk is Climate Debt, Climate Colonialism, and Climate Reparations, Forging a Just Future. That's to get a little bit of a sense of who will be rounding our opening plenary conversation for the day. And I will now turn to our first speaker for the first session, Imagining Planetary Vitality, given by Dr. Rita Sherman. Rita. Rita, you were muted.
No, I'm not muted anymore. Thank you very much, Devin. Thank you very much for the introduction. I want to take this opportunity to plug our forthcoming volume, which I'm co-editing. And because so many of our speakers, including Professor Valerie Miles-Tribble and Professor Cynthia Molobida in the plenary session, as well as many of our speakers later on, have contributed to that volume. It's a 35-chapter volume called Religion and Sustainability, Interreligious, Interdisciplinary Responses, and we should have that out just within some few months. The title of my talk today is Sentience and Sensitivity, the Self-Awareness of Plants. In spite of increasing data that points to plant sentience and self-awareness, there is a resistance to the idea that plants evince intelligent patterns of responsiveness to their surroundings. Many are highly invested in the promotion of the idea that humans are not only the apex of all life, but that we are the only self-conscious entities on planet Earth. Such an anthropocentric perspective is not only dangerous for efforts to care for and restore endangered populations of animals, plants, and delicate ecosystems. This viewpoint, in addition, is scientifically flawed according to the studies emerging from the field of plant neurobiology, a fast-growing field that focuses on the study of plant signaling and adaptive behavior. The foundational aim of plant neurobiology is to account for plant intelligence, to unveil the ways in which plants perceive and plan to diverse stimuli in purposeful ways. Research now demonstrates that plants are able to assimilate disparate information streams, make determinations, and potentially perform forecasting behaviors. How we view plants impacts our actions and attitudes towards them. In his best-selling book, The Hidden Life of Trees, Peter Wohlleben argues that to save the world's woodlands, we must first appreciate that trees are, quote, wonderful beings, unquote, with intrinsic capacities for information processing, communication with other trees, adaptation, and the incredible ability to nourish and heal others of their kind. Stefano Mancuso of the University of Florence researches plant behavior. He examines the ways in which they resolve a crisis, respond to stimuli, the way they memorize, their modes of communication. Plants, including large trees, don't simply provide shelter, they also provide food, right? So indeed, they are food, they are lunch. Their branches, leaves, flowers, bark are all consumed by a variety of creatures. So they had evolved a brain, and it was situated in a particular place in their body, so to speak. The plant would be exposed to constant extreme fatal danger. In other words, the brain, or let's say the apparatus that cognizes, processes stimuli, and responds cannot be local for trees or plants. It must be diffuse. So the neurophysiology of plants has evolved through diffusion. Mancuso explains that, I quote, we need to imagine a plant as a huge brain, maybe not as efficient as in the case of animals, but diffused everywhere. Accretion of data on trees regarding their capacity to fend off threats, respond using memories of past critical experiences, nourish their offspring, and communicate with other trees, all via chemical means, has resulted in the unfortunate consequence of some researchers using the term consciousness in regard to trees. Now, why do I say unfortunate? It's unfortunate because it undermines the groundbreaking epistemic schism that seems to point to that an extensive awareness that trees exhibit may force a change in our definition, or at the very least, our understanding of consciousness. Peter Wohlleben has discussed how trees are sophisticated entities that live in kindred networks, support neighboring trees that are ailing, make decisions, and combat predators. He has been criticized for anthropomorphizing trees, but it may be his language rather than the research he points to that is so offensive to different interests, such as corporate interests and corporate funded research interests that are invested in the perception of trees and forests as non-sentient, non-aware, vegetative material resources for our utilitarian purposes. Listen to Wohlleben language. I quote, one thing is that the mother trees suckle their children. They feed the young trees just enough sugars produced by its own photosynthesis to keep it from dying. Trees in a forest of the same species are connected by roots which grow together like a network. Their root tips are highly sensitive, brain-like structures that can distinguish whether the root that it encounters in the soil is its own roots, the roots of another species, or the roots of its own species. If it encounters its own kind, I don't know if scientists yet know how this happens, but we have measured with radioactive marked sugar molecules that there is a flow from healthy trees to sick trees so that they will have an equal measure of food and energy available, unquote. So why does he use this language of sentience, of conscious beings seeking flourishing closer to human beings than we wish to acknowledge? He is clear about this. He is clear that climate action, staving off catastrophic impacts, will require human societies to perceive forests with entirely new lenses. He asserts that while climate responders are internationally trying to limit the warming of climate change to a couple of degrees, undisturbed forests can do much better than that. He notes that forests create their own microclimate. When we thin forests, he notes, temperatures of course rise, humidity goes down, evaporation increases, and all the trees begin to suffer. So trees have a stake in support to keep all members of the community healthy. Mancuso argues against using loaded terms, including consciousness. He prefers awareness, strongly asserting that there is no life that is not aware of itself, or that is not able to solve problems that it faces on a regular basis. There are many examples of the ways in which trees process stimuli, and respond with active strategies. For example, when corn is nibbled by caterpillars, the plant emits a distress signal that lures parasitic wasps to exterminate them. Science struggles to view plants as active and motivated because its outlook is so, and according to a whole series of plant neurobiologists. Another misconception that they point to is that plants are incommunicative and insensate to their surroundings. Indeed, they are in many complex ways, even more sensitive than animals. Mancuso notes this. He says that this is based on evidence from numerous studies, and that we know that a single tree root apex is able to detect at least 20 different chemicals and physical parameters, many of which we are blind to. So for example, there could be a huge amount of copper or iron ore under our feet, and you and I would have no awareness of it. Whereas plants can sense a few milligrams in a massive amount of soil. But on the problem of terminology, quite a number of researchers whose works touches on neurobiology have increasingly gone there, to that dangerous terrain of consciousness. For example, Paco Calvo, writing in the Journal of Consciousness Studies in Molecular Plant Science, he's a researcher in molecular plant science, and he argues as follows, quoting him, "Consciousness, we may concur, probably dates back to the Cambrian explosion. But if the alleged structures that support subjective experience are basal to vertebrate and insect clades, plants should at least be given an opportunity, if only, to cancel their consciousness status," unquote. He notes that philosophy and cognitive sciences have until very recently been neglectful of the discipline, but fortunately the topic, according to him, is not taboo anymore. He notes that, as it turns out, plants are able to integrate diverse sources of information, make decisions, even are enabled to perform predictive modeling. As a matter of fact, plants can be habituated, and this has been known for over a century, at least since the work of J.C. Bose. Who was J.C.? Jagdish Chandra Bose, Sir Jagdish Chandra Bose, who was knighted 1858 to 1937, was a famous Indian Hindu scientist and one of the world's first biophysicists. Plant neurobiologist Virginia Shepard presents Bose's early work as a pioneering research that drew controversy in the 1920s, but aligns perfectly with the novel data a century later. She says, I quote, "He was the first person to use a semiconducting crystal to detect radio waves and the ingenious inventor of a portable apparatus for generating and detecting microwaves. Bose extended his specialist knowledge of the physics of electromagnetic radiation into insightful experiments on the life processes of plants. Bose concluded that plants and animals have essentially the same fundamental physiological electromagnetic mechanisms. All plants coordinate their movements and responses to the environment through electric signaling. All plants are sensitive explorers of their world." His overall conclusion that plants have an electromechanical pulse, a nervous system, a form of intelligence, and are capable of remembering and learning was not well received in its time. 100 years later, concepts of plant intelligence, learning, and long-distance electrical signaling have entered mainstream literature, end quote. So J.C. Bose was a Vedantic Hindu, and this matters because of the worldview embedded in that philosophy that allowed him to be familiar with the tradition's perception of trees. A very different view than the scientific world in which he shone so brightly. But these ancestral visions would no doubt have moved him into a place of comfort to conduct his research. Many Vedic rituals, at their core, are liturgies born of creation, of the winds whistling through canyons, of rivers rushing wildly through mountain passes, and the lilt of birdsong floating into human spaces from the more than human world. Because Vedic liturgies are of the earth, because they are indigenous, because they're place-based, they lend themselves to revisioning new vistas and in recultivating on new soil. And it is important, and I mean new conceptual soil. And it is important to think of this as an idea of an ecological consciousness viewed as necessary for the benefit of humanity and nature through the sacred acts of ritual, however we may conceive ritual. This is what I refer to as the eco-praxis of the reciprocity of reverence. These ancient forms of eco-theological praxis, or just spiritualities of place, mingle with the universal vision of the science held by J.C. Bose and other groundbreaking scientists, including the ones today. An epistemology grounded in humility and openness would take us a long, long way towards care and repair of the earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. A little bit of housekeeping as we proceed. Rather than having Q&A after each talk, we're going to be tabling it at the end when we will open up the webinar to all the participants who are tuning in from around the globe. So we'll move right along into our second speaker from Dr. Whitney Bauman with Developing a Critical Planetary Romanticism, CPR for the Earth. Whitney.
Thank you so much. It is great to be with you all on Holy Hill, even though I wish we were in person. And I'm an alum of the GTU, as Devin mentioned, and I have my GTU mug here, which you can't see very well because the fake screen, it makes it do funny things. But on one side it says the Graduate Theological Union, on the other it says where religion meets the world. And it's kind of fitting because now I think what I'm doing today is talking about how religion helps to make the world. And I think that's what I'm trying to talk about today. So the title that I've sort of tweaked a little bit is Religion as Re-Attunement, Developing a Critical Planetary Romanticism, or CPR for the Earth. And as with any sort of work, this is, there are a lot of people and things that need to happen here. So first of all, I want to thank Rita Sherma, Devin Zuber, Matthew Hartman, and the whole team at the GTU for inviting me to this session. I also want to thank the Seminar on Religion and New Materialisms at the American Academy of Religion, the Alexander Humboldt Foundation, the Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict at Arizona State University, which have all helped me get to stages of what I'm about to tell you. This is sort of work that's going into a new manuscript that hopefully will be done soon. Also, there is a journal article that's going to be published soon in the Journal for the Society for the Study of Religion, Nature, and Culture, from which some of this comes, and the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at Florida International University. All these places have given me time and space to think through some of these things. So I just want to thank them. And actually, I wanted to start with something that connects up with what Rita was talking about in terms of plants from Anat Singh, her last book before this project being The Mushroom at the End of the World, which talks about the fungal networks that sort of link all the plant world underground, and this sort of thing is sort of like an information highway. So I thought that was a fitting connection. This quote is from her project Feral Atlas, which here's the link to it online here. And it just, she says this: other species as well as non-living things make it possible to be human. That this statement is not obvious to many humans at this moment in time is only because of habits of thought that have become powerful over the last few hundred years. In this modernist mode of thinking, humans presume to transcend and master nature rather than forming worlds together with non-humans. One significant of recent discussion of the Anthropocene as a time of human-sponsored environmental crises is that it urges us away from those powerful habits of thought. The imagined mastery of humans no longer looks so successful. We are asked to reconsider the ways in which human and non-human histories are inextricably intertwined. The Anthropocene, like every other trajectory in which humans have been involved, is more than human. And so I just wanted to start then with that that brief reflection. And I have 4 small parts to get through in my little 15 minutes of time. So let me just get started here. Part 1 is religion as reattunement. Sort of, what do I mean by that? I think religion as reattunement works on many levels. First of all, it works sort of etymologically if you go with the etymology of religion as rereading or binding together. So the gathering of information together to sort of make meaning out of things and to rethink things and to re-narrate things. There's that re part of reattunement that helps us to realize that this is an ongoing process. It's not a thing that's out there, but it's a process. It also, this idea of attunement, I think you see the sort of instrument strings there, it works sort of on an aesthetic level, aesthetic attunement, ethical attunement, musical attunement, bodily attunement, intellectual attunement, all these different ways in which we can think about doing religion. I think this idea of attunement works. There's also multiple ways of being tuned and reattuning based upon our embodiments. And then I think if we look at the sort of history of world religions, we can think about the different ways that various sort of traditional world religions or whatever we want to call the major traditions or whatever, have been about sort of, reattuning. We can talk about sort of the awakenings in Buddhism and Jainism, and the tuning into the worlds around them that the Buddha and Lord Mahavir were calling for in these sort of break-off movements of the background Vedic traditions. Or we can talk about yoga of the Vedic traditions, right, and the attunement of the body to the world around us. The reattunement to worlds and monotheisms, calling out injustices and such in the worlds around them. Shamanic journeys and boundary crossings, right? Reopening worlds to reattune to new ones. So blurring the boundary between the living and the dead and human and animal and this sort of thing. So there's all sorts of ways in which these sort of more traditional religions that as we think of them are about sort of reattuning to the worlds around us. But then there's also the types of things like that Bron is familiar with, and that Bron's and a lot of his students at the University of Florida write about, which is, biking, hiking, fishing, surfing. These are all sort of ways of reattuning to the worlds around us too. They can be practices that help us attune to the worlds around us. Reading, right? I'm sure that hopefully Devin will agree a little bit that literature can be a great source of reattunement, and many others as well. Sex, environmentalism, and other types of activisms, right? These can all be ways of reattuning to the worlds around us. And in some sense, I think if you look at the history of, if you look at evolutionary theory and if you look at ecology, these two sciences that help us, that rewrite humans into the rest of the planetary community in major ways, they're about sort of reattuning our bodies to the worlds around us, the evolutionary history of worlds from which our bodies emerge, the ecosystems that we find ourselves in that become our insides, right? Our microbiomes are reflections of the ecologies in which we're in. Sort of these sorts of things. How do we attune to this life, this multiplicity of life around us? I also think it's important here to remember that this is a sort of planetary process. One way of describing life is that it's a process of constant reattunement. And when we stop attuning to things, then that means we're dead, right? It's not just a human thing, but reattuning is the whole process of life itself, and living organisms constantly engaging in this process. So I think there's a way in which this idea of religion as reattunement sort of helps to ground religion as it's sort of a planetary process and a planetary project. To remember how to do this. There we go. Okay, so that's sort of part one, religion as reattunement. And now part two, why am I asking, what's the point of reattuning at this very moment? So that this is the current moment of reattunement. And I think we might call it our apocalyptic moment. But it's the result of twin phenomena that I think really shape life on the global scale, and that is the process of globalization through the increased speed of communication, transportation, and production technologies, and also climate change that's directly related to that. So globalization is sort of this, it's also the mixing up of every single place on the planet, so that any place that we are is always and already intersected by global flows of information and energy and materials. And so we can't untangle ourselves from this this giant well, organism, if you want, but this giant assemblage of other life forms and technologies and languages and cultures and this sort of thing that make up any given place in the world. So that's sort of one part of globalization. And then there's, of course, the economic globalization that probably Cynthia will talk about, perhaps, which is the sort of neoliberal sort of capital globalization, which has led to these gross economic inequities and a lot of the problems of justice that many people here probably are interested in, want to address today. And then climate change, of course, climate change, human-caused climate change, I should say, is also sort of this planetary phenomenon that's happening that can't be solved by any one location, that is going to take some sort of planetary-wide effort to address, although not all places, not all peoples are equally to blame, so on and so forth, and the effects don't happen equally as well. But climate change also means, right, that we don't manage the earth, right? This is the sort of cutting us off at the knees and thinking that that we are some sort of managers or stewards of the earth. We're not. We're part of a planetary community, and it's a very complex and set of problems, wicked problems, some would call them, but also within this nexus, right, of globalization and climate change, we're also dealing with this sort of pandemic, right? And the pandemic, I think, has highlighted the breakneck speed at which this process of globalization has been occurring, and all the injustices and environmental problems that have come along with it. The Black Lives Matter movement, of course, became highlighted greatly during the pandemic because the pandemic, number one, affected people of color much more, but also because many people had the time to pay more attention, right? Because we weren't just living life as normal. Many of us were still working. It's a privileged perspective to say that, you know, I was able to sit at home and make sourdough bread, but at the same time, life was sort of jolted out of its normalcy, and so more people were paying attention. And I think that this led to a sort of collection of energy around this, right? So the Me Too movement, right, has also been of recent. The Dakota Pipeline movement, species extinction movement, the whole de-extinction movement, not de-extinction, but the I'll think of it in a minute, but the movements around sort of noticing the extinction of species and this sort of thing. And then, of course, the pandemic, all of these have this connection with this idea of I can't breathe, right? And it took maybe a pandemic for it to come into the minds of, you know, middle-class white Americans like myself, but this twin phenomenon of globalization and climate change, right? And it's ties with inequalities and racisms and sexism. Women, people of color, indigenous peoples have many different species on the planet have already not been able to breathe, right, for a long time. So I call this sort of our apocalyptic moment, not because it's the end of the world, but because it is the uncovering of something new, the destruction of something that was worlds that were before, and the uncovering of possibilities for something that is yet to come. And of course, many indigenous peoples and many enslaved peoples, particularly I'm thinking here of African Americans in this country, have lived through apocalypses before, have lived through the end of the world before. So this is not, again, a new thing to have worlds end. But then the question becomes, I think, how can we reattune to the bodies around us, listening to all of these different voices saying, I can't breathe, right? To expand out and listen to as many voices as possible that make up the planetary community, right? So this reattunement can't be done just sort of willy-nilly, right? You can you can you can also you know, racism and colonialisms and nationalisms and fascisms are also attunements. they're attunements that exclude a lot, right? So then I think we need this critical moral ethical tool to help guide us in these reattunements, and that's what I'm trying to get at with this idea of the critical planetary romanticism, or CPR, for the Earth. So let me just start with the last term and work my way up to the first term. So what do I mean by romantic? I mean that simply that we should see agency, vitality, and value distributed throughout the entire planetary community, so that it's not just located in humans and within that just some humans, but that we are in this sort of living vital world. So animisms, neo-animisms, the new materialisms, many sources of thought, process thought, many sources of thought get us to this idea of distributed agency, vitality, and value that I'm trying to get at. So that's what I mean by romantic, right? But the next part of that is the planetary part. We can't just attach romanticism to local places. This becomes problematic because it can become very localistic and even sometimes nationalistic, right? And then sort of don't let invasive species in or invasive peoples in, right? This sort of thing. So I want this romanticism to be attached to at a planetary scale, in a way that Bear Caldecott has talked about and many others, and not sort of at just a single local place. So perhaps there could be a polyamory of place, which I've talked about in other places, in terms of love of multiple places across the planet, and understanding how these places connect together. It also means, this planetary part means that humans are creatures among creatures. We humans are just a part of the rest of the planetary community. And then of course, critical is where all of the critical theories come in: critical race theory, feminism, queer theory, colonial, post-colonial theory, decolonial theory. All bodies do not experience our worlds the same, and we have to listen to the multiple ways in which bodies experience the worlds as they're built around us, right? And sort of the more bodies we listen to, the better we'll be able to create an attunement, a reattunement with others that brings about a more just and more sustainable, a planetary community that promotes flourishing for multiple peoples, places, things, this sort of thing. And so, conclusion here. This is sort of, I think, in the end, what I'm talking about is a call for an experimental approach to meaning making, right? So we collect together information about how our ideas sort of ripple out into the world and how they affect different bodies differently. How they discard some bodies and create violence towards some bodies while promoting other bodies and create injustices. Then we do these cartographies of violence, as Rob Nixon sort of talks about. Sort of how do these ideas take shape in the world, and who are they affecting negatively and positively, these sorts of things. And then we collect, we sort of deconstruct, collect, and then recollect again in Latour's understanding of the collective, right? And this process, I think, looks more like this, again, Rita, you mentioned birdsong and this sort of thing, and this is my image for what this process looks like. It's the starling murmuration, right? And the ways in which there's not a telos actually, but there is order, and all the different bodies that are part of a murmuration have to pay attention to the others, and they move along in different ways and different shapes and this sort of thing. So there's deep complex structure, but yet there's not an obvious teleology. It's an emergent sort of meaning and value and this sort of thing that sort of takes account of the multiple bodies that are making up this community. And so I think in the end here, what we need also is some serious undisciplining of the university. We need to have undisciplined thinking and wild thoughts, because in truth, I think the current disciplinary structure that we all probably on this call or on this screen right now we're taught under is part of the very disciplinary boundaries that have helped create the world that is problematic right now. So we need multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and sort of ways of thinking outside of these disciplined ways of thinking. So I'll just end there. Thank you.
Thanks, Whitney. That was great. And also awesome to see a GTU mug there on your screen briefly for a second. We'll move right on to me. I'm next, and I promise what I'm going to have to say has some gaps and holes like everyone else. In our first sessions, we've had to compress very complex ideas to a narrow bandwidth of 15 minutes, so I apologize in advance for some of the fissures that are still in what I'm going to say. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, the title of my talk is Playing, Not Praying for the Planet, Art, Imaginaries, and the Anthropocene. So here we are. With 2020 receding in hindsight, we take stock of an ongoing amplification of the cascading effects of climate change. To paraphrase David Wallace Wells, their imprecation in an ongoing litany of an increasingly depressing series of facts and figures. Rising ocean levels, climactic instability, increased drought, wildfire, last year being the largest fire season on record in the state of California here. We all know the roster of the uninhabitable Earth that we find ourselves at home in. This seems to be our inevitable future. But 2020, our pandemic annus horribilis, also brought some incredibly beautiful and incisive moments in the longue durée of our species' history. Deep in a remote canyon of a rainforest in Colombia, a team of archaeologists and anthropologists publicly revealed their discovery of what is one of the largest extant complexes of prehistoric cave paintings and rock art in the world, winding over 8 miles long on an inaccessible canyon cliff face. This so-called Sistine Chapel of prehistoric imagery, over 13,000 years old, is a gallery of the ghosts of extinction. Many of the species depicted, interspersed with ochre outlines of human hands, are of megafauna that have since vanished: giant sloths, woolly mammoths, and other denizens of the not too distant Pleistocene. Our proximity to this radically different climate, handprints on stone walls, our ancestors we can hypothetically touch, unsettle some of the hubris embedded within the Anthropocene's end times apocalyptic register. Our planet has been here before. As Whitney put it, this is not a new thing to have the world's end when we think about climatic disruption within minoritized and oppressed communities. Closer at home, here in California, last year also saw the remarkable discovery in a cave along the Central Coast that the local indigenous Chumash tribes who had been making cave and rock art in that area for millennia were likely doing it in concert with the plant world. A distinctive whirling pattern found in the walls of the cave echoed in perfect symmetry the flower of the hallucinogenic datura plant that grows in the area. Thanks to advancement made in DNA technology, archaeologists were able to determine that chewed matter on the floor of the cave was in fact leaves of the datura, suggesting that these whirling patterns on the wall were directly related to the altered states of consciousness enabled by the plant. This discovery seems less a verification of something like Terence McKenna's so-called stoned ape theory, a kind of biological reductionism that the origins of religion are to be found in psychotropic plants, but rather to observe that these earliest forms of representation that graph our relationality with the other than human was entangled in plant worlds that offered other modes of being and thinking, kind of wild thinking. Since the very beginning, our capacity for art making is a negotiation with the other and the more than human. This leaves its mark not only in the visual remnants of our ancient past, of course. Thinking of attunement here, recent archaeological discoveries in the floors of various prehistoric caves in Europe have uncovered the oldest known musical instruments. When reconstructed and played, these ancient bone flutes reveal themselves to create sounds in the pentatonic scale, a kind of harmonic patterning that humans share with certain species of birds, such as the European hermit thrush. There seems indeed to be some truth to that old romantic fantasy, perhaps articulated most beautifully by the German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder, that the origins of human language and all symbolic and abstract thought lay not in some arbitrary agreement of social conventions, a la John Locke, but in birdsong, in our mimetic capacity for reproducing a concerto, as Herder put it, of all of nature's voices that we came to hear sounding and singing around us. Arguably, however, the aesthetic, be it constituted by music, painting, poetry, literature, or whatever, has only more recently become preoccupied with the ethical dimensions of our relationship with the natural world. The very word aesthetic in Greek, originally a meaning from senses, sense meaning, is coined precisely at the same historical juncture when the Western world was radically transformed by the twin machines of industrial capitalism and colonial expansion, and the arts accordingly shifted into new modes of representation. The landscape moves from being a minor secondary art form to a preeminent form of painting, what had been incidental background for scenes depicting history, religion, mythology, becomes quite literally the foregrounded subject. In literature, the close of the 18th century and the advent of various forms of post-Enlightenment romanticisms, varied and heterogeneous as they certainly all were, produced remarkably similar forms of devout attention to the natural world, from William Wordsworth's poetry set in England's Lake District, to closer at home, the later American transcendentalisms of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. As the aesthetic became both professionalized and disciplined by the appearance of art history and literary criticism as new fields of knowledge production, liminal terrains that lay both in and outside of the modern university, aesthetics became tied to broader philosophical concerns as to what constituted the beautiful. A bevy of new perceptual categories accompany the spectacular ascendancy of landscape painting and its literary twins, romantic nature poetry and prose, the sublime, the picturesque, the panoramic, to name a few of the usual suspects here, which all serve to augment cultural understandings of the beautiful and its locus in nature. And as we know, this transformation is really remarkable in the bigger picture, how mountaintops and other wild places went from being places that were seen as dangerous, unholy, to desired places of sublime epiphany. And wildness is the preservation of the world, as Henry David Thoreau could write in the 1860s, as he watched with great concern the rampant expansion of the American frontier in the West. But has this kind of wilderness beauty now in the Anthropocene finally attenuated itself? For better or for worse, the aesthetics of much contemporary environmentalism, particularly in the United States, continues to rely on the tropes of its romantic genesis. Anselm Adams' coffee table books and calendars, the constant repackaging of John Muir's prose into cutesy aphorisms for mugs, bumper stickers, and t-shirts. The last 20 years have seen a robust critical discourse emerge that has contested the normative assumptions embedded in this kind of visual aestheticization and modification of the wild. In art history that has followed the work of Angela Miller, for example, a hermeneutics of suspicion has unmasked the landscape genre's deep complicity in abetting the imperial ideology of manifest destiny. In ways, for example, that in this painting by Albert Bierstadt, the rugged American wilderness could reify power relations between indigenous peoples and Western white observers, as we see when we look at the optics of how this painting is put together. William Cronin's influential Anatomy of the Trouble with Wilderness has underscored how inadequate the romantic sublime and beautiful have been for the protection of vital ecological zones. In fact, it is often the ugly nature, such as the swamp, the coastal marshland, or the flat prairie meadow, that have been overlooked by legal conservation in favor of more pictorial, spectacular mountain peaks, often at the expense of these critical ecotones. Here in the Bay Area, where we can enjoy the preservation of spaces like Mount Tamalpais across the bay, the critical swamps that once fringed the bay like a green carpet, 90% of that habitat is lost, which is a disaster for the rising levels of the San Francisco Bay. If beauty is suspect, so might be religion, at least in its institutional forms, and these spiritual vectors that adhere to the landscape tradition and its later iterations in things like the land art movement. Within the field of the so-called new materialisms and its older parent of posthumanism, there has been little patience for either the transcendentalism of the mystic or the transporting rapture facilitated by the beautiful, such as Donna Haraway's antipathy for any remnant of the axial sky gods in her Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Cthulhu Scene, or others who have repudiated the persistent shadows of a metaphysics of presence or the ontotheological within the aesthetic. What is needed, the new materialists claim, is more earthy kin-making with other species, other kinds of ethical affiliations and attachments beyond the human. And above all, a sentiment here that ties much of the divergent strands of these new materialists together, a reascription of agency and ontology onto matter and the other than human. New materialist matter is not the dead non-human stuff created by Cartesian dualism, but mysteriously alive and vibrant, in Jane Bennett's phrasing. If this ontological turn enabled by the new materialists, or something like Whitney Bauman's CPR, what does this do to our categorical understandings of beauty and beauty's implication in the history of environmental politics, especially in a North American context? We might consider further de-anthropocizing the aesthetic, for one, so that this realm of specialized symbolic communication is not seen as solely the province of the human. If beauty is hardwired into the very fabric of the cosmos, at least according to process theologians like Alfred North Whitehead and others, then perhaps the natural sciences could more robustly integrate a corresponding capacity for wonder into their research frameworks. How might the brilliant plumage and trilling of songbirds be not merely evolutionary reflexes for finding food and mates, but fundamentally connected to the purposelessness of play, of conscious improvisation for its own sake, in and of itself? Play, of course, has long been regarded as a constitutive element of the aesthetic, at least since Immanuel Kant, who placed the free play of our imaginative and associative faculties at the center of our experience of a work of art. Though Kant has fallen out of favor amongst the new materialists and in much eco-theory, he's too transcendental, too much of an insuperable gap between the noumena and phenomena, there remains a viable path to be trod from Kant's aesthetics into the work on religion undertaken by the late Robert Bellah in his last book, Religion and Human Evolution. Bellah was unafraid to ask the big questions: what is religion? Where does it come from? And he saw the evolution of religion as inextricable from our species' capacity for symbolic representation and thought. Echoing Herder's earlier romanticism, Bellah locates a primordial human musy language evolving in the consciousness of our ancestors, a musical language that critically was both embodied, shaped by the movements, rhythms, passions of the body, and yet offering alternative phenomenal experiences of time and space, the foundations of religious or spiritual experience, in other words. This is the realm of the imaginal, where alternatives to the real could be entertained and played with, as they were for our ancestors when they made these earliest known representations in caves and on cliff faces. Play here offered a distinct evolutionary advantage. It allows humans to collectively envision other worlds, different temporalities, forms of alterity, being with other beings. In the Anthropocene, if beauty and religion are to have futures, it will be in recovering more of the embodied physiological dimensions of this musa language that structures our play in both aesthetic and religious experience, amplifying our capacities for empathy and being with the other than humans that we happen to share this quickly warming planet with. Thank you. Okay, rounding off our first panel session today is our another illustrious speaker from Florida, Dr. Bron Taylor. Bron, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Well, it's great to see so many old friends and friendly faces here. Without further ado, I'm going to launch right into a lecture that I have recently shortened for this purpose and to remain within our time constraints. And then I can't screw it up because I've already put it down. So I'm going to share my screen and launch right into it. And you'll see some continuities and interesting connections with what's been said earlier as you watch.
For decades, I've wandered through the environmental milieu, the diverse venues wherein environmentally engaged individuals and groups encounter and influence one another. I've interviewed hundreds of Greens, tracked the writers and scientists, activists and artists, and a host of others, learning who and what has inspired them. I've read scores of historical and social scientific studies that address the research question that has long preoccupied my attention. What might mobilize our species to respond effectively to slow and halt the accelerating anthropogenic reduction of Earth's biocultural diversity? I've learned that feelings of kinship with species other than our own often animate pro-environmental behaviors. These feelings are integrated into an overall worldview or cosmovision that includes a cosmogony, in other words, an understanding of how the world came to be the way it is, perceptions of belonging to nature, humility about the human place in the world, convictions that all living things have intrinsic value, as well as love and loyalty to the earth and its living systems. There are many specific experiences and insights that lead to dark green worldviews, as I've come to call them. Such understandings, which are found widely within the global environmental milieu, where pro-environmental actors meet in and influence one another, typically involve these traits and characteristics: a belief that nature itself is sacred, and that all living things have intrinsic value and deserve respect and reverence, and that all living things share a common ancestor and thus are kin. Those who find their way to such understandings do so via three main paths, namely through the senses, through the arts, and through the sciences. These paths are not separate, however. They weave back and forth in reciprocally influential ways through the lives of individuals and groups. Direct, visceral sensory experiences in nature, including experiences of awe and wonder at the beauties, mysteries, and sometimes terror of nature, especially through personal encounters with non-human organisms, are a common pathway to kinship sentiments and ethics. A classic example was provided when John Muir, exulting in the beauty and power of nature and enraptured with various plants and animals, wrote that through such experiences, we feel ourselves a part of wild nature, kin to everything. Another experience that often leads to kinship sentiments and transpires when someone looks into the eyes of a non-human animal. The primatologist Jane Goodall, for example, felt a deep sense of connection looking into the eyes of a male chimpanzee whom she named David Greybeard, which seemed a gateway to his gentle personality. Scores of artists seek to evoke and reinforce kinship with non-human organisms and environmental systems, not uncommonly by expressing kinship feelings first experienced through sensory encounters with other species. Among the diverse artistic methods are nature photography, documentaries, motion pictures, painting, sculpture, novels, and poetry. An apt example is Frans Lanting's Eye-to-Eye, Intimate Encounters with the Animal World, a large book replete with stunning photographs of animal eyes. The artistic expression of our relationships with other species is nothing new. Although we should be humble when speculating, it seems to me that at the very dawn of art, humans were wrestling with their relationships with non-human animals, as they were, apparently, in this cave art from Borneo dated 40,000 years ago. Images and related stories showing blurry lines between humans and other species are common around the world in folk and indigenous cultures, a topic beyond the current purpose. Here I will simply note that the artists from diverse traditions, including those in predominantly Christian cultures, have also showed close connections between humans and other beings, as exemplified by Hudson River School painter Edward Hick, who in this image depicted Noah saving the animals. And in this painting, from his Peaceable Kingdom series, Hicks expressed an eschatological hope that predators and prey would eventually become family in a peaceable kingdom. The sciences, especially astronomy and cosmology, ecology and botany, and evolution and ethology, provide powerful testimony to the kinship of all life. Charles Darwin presaged scientific kinship understandings with these seldom quoted words. If we choose to let conjecture run wild, then animals, our fellow brethren in pain, diseases, death, suffering, and famine, our slaves in our most laborious works, our companions in our amusements, they may partake of our origin in one common ancestor. We may be all netted together. Darwin's suggestion that we empathize with other animals was rooted in an understanding of ecological interdependence, as well as his then emerging understanding of biological kinship. Not long afterward, Ernst Haeckel began artistically illustrating biological kinship with his depictions of evolution as a tree of life, in which all organisms are shown to be biologically related. That this tree of life includes our own species became clear in this 1879 version, which he subtitled The Pedigree of Man. It was ecologist Aldo Leopold, however, who specifically argued that an understanding of evolution should lead to felt kinship with other organisms and a broad environmental ethics. In a Sand County Almanac, which was posthumously published in 1949, Leopold wrote, "It's a century now since Darwin gave us the first glimpse of the origin of species. We know now what was unknown to all the preceding caravan of generations, that men are only fellow creatures with other creatures in the odyssey of evolution. This new knowledge should have given us a sense of kinship with fellow creatures, a wish to live and let live, a sense of wonder over the biotic enterprise. Many others have deduced kinship ethics from scientific understandings. In 1979, biologist E.O. Wilson coined the term biophilia for his theory that human beings have an evolution-derived innate tendency to focus on life and lifelike processes. According to Wilson, biophilia often involves profound appreciation for nature. Science, for its part, according to Wilson, teaches that we are literally kin to other organisms and that our differences are only a matter of degree. For Wilson, this understanding ought to redound in pro-environmental behavior. Kinship is indeed expressed and promoted through the senses, through the sciences, and the arts, often in ways that combine these in creative ways, including via science museums, aquariums, documentary films, art exhibitions, and even theme parks. Indeed, close observation of such phenomena demonstrates that when it comes to the perception of interspecies kinship, there's a permeable boundary between the senses, the arts, and the sciences. Indeed, the sciences and arts begin with the senses, and all three seek to understand the world, while the arts and scientists also seek to explain it. E.O. Wilson had a complementary insight when he described artists as expert observers and art itself as a device for exploration and discovery that, among other functions, is able to instruct by pleasing. This idea of art exploring and explaining the world by pleasing the viewer is worth keeping in mind as I examine artistic expressions of kinship at science museums and aquariums. The Hall of Human Origins at New York City's American Museum of Natural History exemplifies how science curators use diverse sculptures, images, and interpretive panels to teach biological kinship. This display shows that given their evolutionary proximity, 98.8% of human DNA is the same as chimpanzees. Another display extended the analysis of family resemblances between humans and chimpanzees to Goliath frogs by showing the similarity between their appendages. The adjacent text stated, All living things, from people to butterflies to mushrooms, are related to one another. Both humans and birds have eyes, for example. This is a homology, a feature that two different living things inherit from a common ancestor. The adjacent Hall of Biodiversity has many aesthetically pleasing displays of Earth's diverse organisms. One needs little time there to realize that for many visitors, the displays evoke awe and wonder. This venue includes evocative nature-reverencing aphorisms penned by famous scientists, artists, and activists expressing kinship and promoting biodiversity conservation. The Two Oceans Aquarium in Cape Town, South Africa, presents similar messages. It does so, however, in an overtly spiritual and thus unusual way. Its credo, that the ocean is sacred, greets visitors immediately upon entry, while adjacent banners declare that whales are central to the reawakening of our spiritually connected place within the living universe. Here, kinship is not only with whales, but with the entire living universe. As with many museums around the world, scientific understandings were mixed with calls for conservation and evocative words stressing that we all belong to nature. These ideas were communicated via one of South Africa's most famous and influential figures, Nobel Peace Prize winner and anti-apartheid activist, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Tutu stressed that the African principle of Ubuntu should be understood to enjoin felt kinship among all beings. Astute observers there would also recognize that the curators designed the displays to evoke awe, wonder, and even love for marine life and the biosphere as a whole. Many documentaries and theatrical films also exemplify how the arts blend kinship feelings with science and conservation. Some of the earliest nature documentaries were produced by Walt Disney. Its Academy Award-winning True Life Adventure series, which began in 1948, blended science with anthropomorphic storytelling. Disney's animated films, including Bambi in 1942, typically often blur the line between humans and other species while urging respect for their habitats. This is arguably another way to promote kinship feelings and pro-environmental behavior. And following changes in American culture, some of these have drawn on and portrayed in a positive light Indigenous societies as promoting cross-species reciprocity and kinship, such as Pocahontas in 1995 and Brother Bear in 2003. Disney's tradition of documentary filmmaking intensified in 2008 when it launched Disney Nature to foster, as Disney's then CEO put it at the time, greater understanding and appreciation of the beauty and fragility of our natural world. Images at the division's website tugged at the heartstrings, suggesting that Disney Nature will reveal bonds between humans and other species in ways that will capture your heart, while also asking plaintively, what would life be without them? One Disney Nature executive even claimed that their objective is to teach the intrinsic value of nature. Clearly, they sought to do this not only with science, but with emotion-triggering artistry. A year after the establishment of Disney Nature, James Cameron released Avatar, which metaphorically contended that Indigenous peoples have intimate relationships and ethical responsibilities toward all forms of life. The film's call for audiences to wake up and to value all life was reflected in its I See You theme, in Sully's reflection on his own awakening, and in the film's final moment when Sully's eyes suddenly and widely opened, as if to an entirely new consciousness. And although Avatar was not produced by Disney, Cameron and Disney's creatives collaborated to create Pandora, the world of Avatar, a domain within Disney's Animal Kingdom theme park, which opened in 2017. There and throughout the animal kingdom, in a variety of artistic ways, kinship and conservation take center stage. Indeed, rising to the height of 44 meters at the very center of the animal kingdom is a sculpture modeled after the African baobab tree, which is sometimes referred to as the African tree of life. Into its trunk and branches, 325 animals have been sculpted into limbs, wings, and other body parts, and they are entangled in a way that suggests interconnection and kinship. I have sought to highlight the entanglement of the senses, arts, and sciences in the experience, expression, and promotion of perceptions of biological kinship. I've also paid special attention to how, for many, the sciences can lead to or reinforce such sentiments and the biodiversity reverencing values that cohere with them. Coming to an understanding of our intrinsic relatedness to all life leaves unanswered many moral questions. These include how our obligations differ between near, distant, and future relatives, human and not. But as evolutionary theory teaches, human beings share a cognitive and emotional repertoire, which includes the capacity for biophilia and kinship feelings. For some, such understandings and sentiments provide a moral benchmark for compassionate and critical ethical analysis. If such perceptions, sentiments, and values were to grow and become a significant proportion of the human community, we might just find a path toward healthy and resilient socio-ecological systems.
Thanks so much, Bron. That was great. We've had a number of people join our symposium, which is great. So let me just momentarily intervene here and explain what's going on. We've reached the end of the first part of our morning plenary session, which has been looking at different ways of imagining our planetary vitality. And we're now shifting into part 2 of the plenary, which is more focused on questions of justice and ethics. And with more people coming in now in the room, I'm going to briefly reintroduce each of our final 3 speakers for the morning as we come to them. Our first presenter in the second plenary session is Dr. Valerie Miles-Tribble, who is an associate professor for ministerial leadership and practical theology at the GTU. Among her many publications in the field of social justice and theological ethics is her recent Change Agent Church and Black Lives Matter Times, Urgency for Action. The title of her talk this morning is The Great Revolution. Valerie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And it has been wonderful to hear the speakers this morning and to learn so much. The theme of our plenary panel B is Vision for a Viable Tomorrow, the Arc of Justice. And I wanted to hone in on that theme by talking a bit or having us consider this notion of the Great Revolution. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in a 1968 speech given at the National Cathedral spoke these words: "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." The entire speech was entitled Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution, which is itself poignant to consider also in today's tensions and fractures as we undergo a great revolution. The great revolution of today is multifaceted. We live in a time of interstitial issues which are of pandemic proportion, including, but not limited to, the divisive religio-politics infusing public policy and partisan divides. The community-based tensions sparked by the extrajudicial violations of law enforcement, including ICE deportation attacks, against the human right to a dignified process, and the racialized injustices of healthcare disparities unveiled and exacerbated by the COVID-19 onslaught. Last but not least, we have global warming as an issue of pandemic proportion, while we observe the adverse impact on our entire ecosystem that has been ignored or denied as scientifically valid, not to mention the demoralizing invisibility of Indigenous efforts to preserve sacred connections to ancestral grounds for spiritual sustainability. A great revolution often occurs amid crisis, where the survival of chaotic trials and tribulations can only come to pass if we are truly revolutionary. King called us to awake or remain awake, because the only way we can overcome is to be actively revolutionary about forming an arc of justice. As we wrestle with these issues, we realize that a revolution signifies change. Hopefully to experience change that is transformational rather than destructive. Thus, to envision a viable tomorrow per our theme, I invite us to reimagine our weighty role in forming the arc of justice. According to Oxford Dictionary, as a noun, an arc is a bend, a curve, or a curved shape, imaging that justice is not linear. As an ethos, justice is a multi-layered or intersectional phenomenon. One does not go from point A to point B in a straight line along a cut and dry path of singular design. Rather, an arc is created by bending the straight arrow of normative rules. When the weighty resistance of lives oppressed push back with an upward motion against the limiting confines of injustice. Such is the pushback of mobilized voices and sacrifices for the communal survival of personhood and the validation of identity to force that straight arrow of privileged condescension to bend. The arc of justice can also be understood as a verb. That is to say, to arc is to move with a curving trajectory and to push against heteronormative or hegemonic understandings of what is the status quo. The status quo is viewed as normal, acceptable, and requiring conformity. Instead, to arc is to act with the intent to put pressure upon those limiting barriers. Furthermore, scientifically, an arc in electricity occurs when a current or charge jumps a gap in the circuit between two conductors of power. The high voltage arc created by the gap is a spark that is visible to the naked eye, because the energetic field involves the atoms in the air that is the plasma of life for a split second of charged light. In reality, the two conductors of power, racism and capitalism, leave gaps in the ecological energy field of our humanity. Nevertheless, the arc of our revolutionary public justice witness can jump the gap to push against the polarizing points. We become the sparks of the arc to bridge gaps of power. Our passion is what lights our spirits, and we become the kinetic energy that energizes others to grasp the environmental charge of atoms in the air. The very DNA of justice is centered in our actions to become the sparks pushing against the poles of unjust power. As a result, the Great Revolution becomes an arc of justice as a vision or kinetic movement that will pressure the status quo to change. Yes, we will pressure the status quo to change. So why is it that we cannot afford to ignore the issues or to allow our arc spark to extinguish? Essentially, the viability of our tomorrows depend upon what we do today. My justice lens is a womanist communitarian ethos, and I hope you will allow me to quote myself from my book, Change Agent Church in Black Lives Matter Times, Urgency for Action. And I quote, "The socially constructed ideology of othering, wherein individuals or groups are differentiated as inferior and non-included, prompts my analysis of the intersecting injustices. I use a womanist theoethical approach to develop communitarian strategies for justice climates, in which leaders and congregants must engage in critical self-reflection about unjust interactions to prepare themselves for collaborative public witness. I provide an ethical praxis rationale for social change through a womanist lens by investigating for evidence of behaviors associated with the manifestations of oppressive cultural evil in the social systems and the internal infractions in our ecclesial practices," end quote. Thus, in this womanist method, this womanist sensibility, and in many ways shared by feminist sisters, the three-pronged womanist method of ethical analysis to disrupt unjust systems calls us first to openly describe the injustices by using testimonies of lived experiences, followed by deconstructing prevailing biases with resistant strategies that point out the fallacies or lies, even when theologies are misappropriated and misleading. The third prong is to reconstruct a new restorative vision for our lived experiences and an environment where we can thrive. And this method can be contextualized for use by multicultural, interfaith, and intergenerational analysis. The great revolution of public justice proportions authentically engages our push to examine the beliefs and biases that are hindering our actions. Revitalization of our ecosystem requires arc-bending mobilization to address the intersections of socioeconomic and environmental justice. We must attend to human ecology and to the sustainability of our natural resources threatened by privatized self-interest, and we do so by educating to raise awareness for a public witness groundswell to bend the arc of justice. My friends, Mother Earth is groaning. Increasingly, droughts and firestorms result in ecological food deserts, just as joblessness and homelessness result in traumatic deserts of the spirit. In the Bay Area, where a six-figure income by many indices is now considered poverty level, the viability of minimum wage survival is nearly improbable. Families struggle, except for some who are generationally well-heeled to hoard the nepotism opportunities for secure jobs or housing. The responsibility does not just rest with governmental agencies, but with us. Let me say that again. The responsibility does not just rest with the incoming administration. We cannot afford to sigh a breath of relief and think that everything is resolved. The responsibility still rests with us. I leave you with a theme of a recent National Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference for Black church leaders and allies that became an oft-quoted mantra. Holy rage, holy hope. If we don't do it for us, by us, it won't get done. And so I ask, will you join the great revolution to bend the moral arc toward justice? There's an urgency and there's so little time. Yet if we pull together, we shall overcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie, for that electrifying presentation. It's wonderful to have such a well-turned phrase, the arc of justice, open up new insights and perspectives with ecological valences. That was fantastic. Our second speaker in the second part of our plenary, the arc of justice, is Dr. John Grimm, who is a senior lecturer and scholar at Yale University, where he co-founded the Forum on Religion and Ecology with Mary Evelyn Tucker, which has been a major instrumental interlocutor for the field of religion and the environmental humanities. Among his many publications are Indigenous Traditions and Ecology, The Interbeing of Cosmology and Community, which was published by Harvard University Press. And the title of his presentation this morning is Indigenous Humanities and the Narratives of a Viable Future. Dr. Grimm.
Warmest greetings from Connecticut, the homeland of Pequot peoples. I'm very pleased to be with you, and I want to thank the organizers and presenters, and join with them to acknowledge the Quinnipiac peoples here in Connecticut, the Mashantucket and Mohican peoples. I'm a visitor in this land, and I treasure the permission to speak about Indigenous issues in the context of the Pequot homeland. How moving it is to hear Valerie Miles-Tribble's remarks and to feel her reflecting in African-American womanist humanities. I felt like she was telling it like it is. Yeah? And it makes me wonder in my own work, how did Indigenous elders in the context of their societies, how did they tell it like it is? And how did they transmit those values and insights that located youth and their society in the larger meaning of the world that they lived in? What narratives did they tell? And so I put the title Indigenous Humanities and changed my original title a bit to move towards lifeway narratives. And this sense of investigating the question of Indigenous perspectives on issues, of course, raises so many inquiries about the word Indigenous itself. And I'm not trying to universalize the perspective here and use one term to speak or impose one term on such diverse Indigenous societies, over 400 million Indigenous people, 600 million if we count the Tibetan Kurds and Zulus. And it's an overwhelming question to think about imposing terminology and language such as Indigenous or humanities. But I'm using the word Indigenous in the sense of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of the United Nations to draw forward what Valerie and this panel have so focused on so correctly, the arc of justice and the sense of how we bend that arc of justice and how the United Nations put forward this declaration to acknowledge Indigenous populations located around the planet, as you can see in these final comment here. Along with the diverse Indigenous cultures on this planet, This question of humanities and the transmission of creativity, the transmission of values, reminds us of the importance of language, and Bron's comments drawing on Ed Wilson and the reflection upon language and the relationship to the animal world. This sense that we now know 6,000 languages approximately spoken in the world, and of them, 4,000 to 5,000 are indigenous languages. And the vast majority of them are endangered. They are in danger of being lost because of the loss of native speakers. So this diversity in languages, transmitting creativity, we're aware of the role of indigenous societies in bringing awareness through their humanities, through their sense of what they've transmitted by languages, of the diversity within human life on this planet. Along with that, we're now aware of this close connection between cultural diversity and biological diversity, that the highest biological diversity on the globe overlaps with indigenous cultural diversity. This relationship between human societies and the more than human animal world. So the themes for inquiry that I want to raise in this focus on indigenous humanities might be set as attention to lifeway. This term, which I want to explore a bit, focusing on the sense of humanity as a whole journey rather than simply a fixed society. And this lifeway context in the midst of a giving universe from indigenous perspectives, the emphasis that we find again and again from indigenous elders speaking of reciprocity with the world and responsibility for the world. These two opening themes are what I'd like to focus on this talk, but I also wanted to mention this theme of indigenous humanities could certainly be approached by focusing on elders. How do they transmit this knowledge and this traditional environmental knowledge? What are the means for their humanities to take shape to transmit to the youth? Certainly, we know honorable harvest is one way, the acknowledgement of food and seeds, and indigenous communities are much given to these explorations nowadays. We are concerned in studies of indigenous people, especially with rituals. And rituals have often been seen in their structural mode, but from an indigenous perspective, the very humanities of transmission is focused on good mind, the accomplishment of a consensus of a focused activity, this dancing with good mind. So the sensing that was mentioned earlier, minding simultaneous with creativity, with this quest for a healing society. In taking up then this question of indigenous humanity, the transmission of ultimate values in societies, and associating it with with narratives, with the telling of what life is in these societies, we find the wholeness embedded in lifeway narratives is crucial. The sense of a seamless relationship between the human and more than human, this animal, plant, mineral, sentient reality, the land that speaks, thought embedded and arising from the land. And this term cosmovision, in league with lifeway, that cosmovision is that telling of the cosmogony, the origin stories, the cosmology. What is this current world? What is the exchange? What is the responsibility between species and people? What is this economy that is transmitted in indigenous humanities and the interdependence that's seen between life? This image comes at us and fills our visual awareness. And it's an effort I wanted to raise with regard to lifeway, a presentation from the Australian Aboriginal societies in the Northern Territories and Western Australia's a dot art in which the song lines are expressed in these rather visual and striking explications of sacred sites and movement between. We can see here where the arc of justice, as Australian people image it, is not simply one straight trajectory, but is filled with what Valerie was speaking of, all the turns and twists and the song lines moving between sites. So a visual decentering of some of our ideas of the humanities as rational narratives presented in analytical modes, but rather lifeways bring us to the sense that there is no separation in indigenous traditions made between kinship, governance, medicine, and economics, let alone symbol systems, rituals, cosmologies, and ethical behaviors. These then are told as cosmovisions. And these cosmovisions have been told in the past, and they continue to be told into the present. Lifeway terms are found among most indigenous societies and are well known by those who make them apparent to those who come from outside as allies to try and bridge and bring our students into understanding of, say, Yupik people in Alaska speak of Yarak, the way of being embodied humans, the sense of the body as transmitting these deepest values in relationship to other bodies in the world. And Anishinaabe Ojibwe communities speak of Bimadisiwin, generally translated the good life, a focus on what it is that the world affords the human in order to live. What comes out of this giving world and the reciprocity back from the people that creates the good life for all of the earth community. And Lakota people speak of mitakuyasin, the sense of we are all related, and the capacity of elders when they teach ceremonial life to Lakota youth, that the entry into a sweat lodge is preceded by the statement, mitakuyasin, we are all related, going into a ritual moment, acknowledging the sense of indigenous humanities, laying out the life way, how to participate in the life way. So indigenous humanities opens this question, what is the human, by focusing on, are we individuals or part of a whole? How does the human and the social order relate to the larger cosmovision that we explicate in this society? So we know lifeway perspectives are new to academic discourse, that indigenous peoples have been denied their place at this table. And now as indigenous elders and spokespeople come forward, they let us know of this inherent whole of their lifeway traditions, that their stories are narratives of the generative character of cosmological existence, which is individually expressed in reptiles, stone, humans, plants, and clouds. So humanities make us aware that humans, among all the other species also, we are all anthropocosmic beings. Rather than the human as anthropocentric, we are anthropocosmic, related to this larger world. And the humanities then are ways of transmitting it. Just yesterday, I heard a Winnimun Wintun, a dancer, speak of his reflection on dancing at the ceremonial. And he said, this is my humanity. That sense of his reflection upon the participation in the ritual, something larger than himself, the humanities as transmitting a larger understanding of the cosmovision, which is manifest in these rituals. And now we find in environmental protection that indigenous communities are manifesting this sense of indigenous humanities in their resistance to damaging or extractive environmental projects. So this is now being understood as their cosmopolitics. And we see in such a moment as the standing up of the Hunkpapa people on the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, where there was not simply resistance to the Dakota Access Pipeline as the transmission of fossil fuels, but more than that, it was the act of responsibility by the people to recognize that that which has given them life, water, their kinship with water, called for their protection. So their humanities brought them into an understanding, a current reflection, and the capacity to transmit this understanding in their humanities. So resistance with resilience. And this resilience then is a transition I want to make, that the activism in resisting the pipelines, I want to suggest, is also connected with their sense of traditional cultural values we might associate here with the arts. And the Metropolitan Museum mounted an exhibition which was curated by indigenous artists and academics. And this particular exhibition had several statements as you walked in the hall of the exhibition. One was by a colleague here at Yale, Ned Blackhawk, a Western Shoshone historian, who made this statement: to engage Native art is to reconsider the meanings of America. For me, when I read this, this was an effort by Ned to mount a statement from the standpoint of indigenous humanities, that this question of the meanings of America is being revisited as we hear indigenous scholars, elders present their understandings of this question of meaning in America. The curators also made this statement. Brian Vallow, an academic and advocate, was speaking about the very works in this exhibition as still serving their purpose. The lives of these material objects are not complete. They are fulfilling the thoughts and prayers of their makers. They offer blessings to all people, even those who visit these galleries. And the chief curator, Richard West of the Southern Cheyenne, introduced this exhibit in this way: the interconnectedness of everything, the symbiosis of who we are and what we do, the nexus between the intangible and the tangible, the interdependence of the physical and spiritual. These concepts embody the whole philosophy of Native life and culture. This is what I'm suggesting is Lifeway. This philosophy, cosmovision here, speaks volumes about the relationship between Native arts and our continuance as vital and living peoples and cultures into a future that the ancestors wanted, the arc of their history. Their ancestors fought and died for this arc. It's on their behalf then that this was mounted, and let us never cease honoring their gift, Richard West reminds us. One of the questions that I see this exhibit bringing us towards engaging in an inquiry is how aesthetic values in this transmission of humanities in indigenous societies emphasizes relationality, as we have heard so many of the speakers talk of today. A recovery, again, the meanings of America. Indigenous people are bringing us into a deeper understanding of a point that we're beginning to realize, this ecological relationality and the sense of cosmological giving. When Mary Evelyn and I mounted this film, Journey of the Universe, we were very aware with Brian Swim of the sense of the giving character of the universe. Brian's paternal relationship into Fraser River Salish had made him aware of this giving universe. In the exhibit, one of the first artistic statements was this piece of leisure art, and a Arapaho warrior who had been imprisoned was given colored pencils to pass his time of boredom. And one of the images that he created is, I believe, a powerful statement of Arapaho or indigenous humanities. He is telling us of his vision experience in this ecstatic mode where he pictures himself upside down, these radiating lines of power to the spirit experience of horse and bird and the human form of this spiritual presence, which has given to him the shield, the winged shield, and next to it, the coup stick, the most significant item of a warrior to touch the enemy. That touching was more significant honor than the killing. And then the teepee, the habitat, he is given through this moment of contact in the spiritual presence of the powers of the world, the ability to put designs upon his habitat and to wear armor to protect him in his exploits. So this sense also in the northern plains of this Lakota shirt, where the rain is so evident in this statement of power, where the hail, the blue hail is embedded in the falling rain, and the white clouds pictured on this warrior shirt. And this transfer again of the knowledge in the very wearing of his vision experience. So also the healer in the Northwest coast who would put on this tunic is bringing us into awareness and bringing her people into an understanding. She's transmitting and humanities of the knowledge of power and how it has come to her, and she is able to bring that to bear in a healing experience. This transmission then of indigenous humanities, to conclude, is a narration of relational lifeways that arise from the land and the power embedded in the land. It's told through narratives of cosmovision, in which the personal body is related to the social body of the community, the ecological body of our more than human kinship, and that celestial exchange with the cosmological whole. These narratives of cosmovision and lifeway then are now being implemented by indigenous people in their cosmopolitics, where they are standing up for the earth community. And so often I hear a critical remark that their cosmopolitics is to serve their own communities exclusively. And I think these insights that I've tried to present here verify very clearly that the sovereignty that indigenous people are transmitting in their humanities is a sovereignty and a resilience that stands for the earth community as a whole. Thank you very much for your time and for this time together.
Thanks so much, John. That was really provocative and very beautiful too, those images which I'd not seen before. I would like to remind everybody that we are approaching the end of our plenary session, and we will have space for engagement with all of the speakers. And we would encourage people attending today's session to post questions in the Q&A box on the side of the Zoom screen. You can use that. We already have 2 questions queued there, and we can add more on. And it's a great pleasure for me to now introduce our final speaker for the morning plenary session that will round out the conversation on the arc of justice, and that is Dr. Cynthia Molobida, who is full professor of theological and social ethics here at the GTU. She's published widely in those fields, and her book, Resisting Structural Evil, Love as Ecological Economic Vocation, has won many awards, and it's been a go-to text in the field of environmental ethics and religion. And her presentation today is entitled Climate Debt, Climate Colonialism, and Climate Reparations, Forging a Just Future. Cynthia.
Thank you, Devin. I am just so moved by the wedding of beauty and brutality in life that this constellation of talks has portrayed. We have been feasting on the luscious food of ideas and brilliance. So may we here gathered dare to recognize the incredible import of our moment in history. One South African climate scientist says this may be the most important 5 years in human history. May we recognize that, so that we will bring the golden gift of human ideas to bear in the struggles for a more just and ecological society and world. Before I begin, I want to just acknowledge that we have been sitting, and would you take a moment just to honor your body by stretching? Just let yourself stretch up and back. Let your head move a little bit. Honor the energy flowing through your body. Give thanks for the trillions of little microorganisms enabling you to breathe and think at this moment. And I'd like to begin my talk with the tormenting reality that we all know so well. Climate change is caused overwhelmingly by the world's high-consuming people, yet it is wreaking death and destruction foremost on impoverished people who are disproportionately people of color. In response to that reality, I argue that a moral perspective calls for recognizing climate change as a matter of climate debt, entailing white privilege, class privilege, and global north privilege. Why approach climate change in these terms? Well, what constitutes a right moral response to a situation depends upon what the problem is understood to be. Inadequate analysis or description leads to inadequate remedies. Response to climate change is commonly framed as a matter of environmental sustainability. This calls for the vitally important move of rapidly and vastly reducing greenhouse gas emissions. If climate change were not connected historically and contemporarily to the power imbalances that have rendered climate debt, then this response would be ethically adequate. It is, however, an inadequate and deceptive moral response for affluent societies if we, 1, are disproportionately responsible for climate change, 2, have accumulated our wealth from the fossil fuel economies that generated the climate crisis, and 3, if we have produced or helped to produce economic orders that impoverished many people through colonialism and imperialism, thus rendering them less able to survive climate change-related natural disasters. The probable consequences of an environmental sustainability approach alone are sinister. They allow the world's high-consuming societies and people to continue to protect ourselves from the most disastrous impacts, assume that all nations have equal obligations to reduce carbon emissions, and fail to take responsibility for climate debt. As a result, affluent societies and sectors, disproportionately white, will remain far more likely to survive the ravages of climate change than are other people. Just to illustrate, when yields of food staples diminish due to rising temperatures, neoliberal international trade and investment mechanisms, not adjusted in light of climate debt, would enable corporate agribusiness and the finance industry to raise prices and maximize profit. In the process, those of us with investment in those industries would gain financially, while impoverished people would be priced out of food. That is, once again, starvation will happen as a result of economic policy, and those who starve will be largely people of colors other than white. If climate change, on the other hand, is seen not only as a problem of ecological sustainability, but also a problem of climate debt, damage done by one group to another, or human rights abused, then more is required in response. Debt owed by the wealthy to the impoverished calls for compensation. Damage done or rights abused may call for reparations. For any who value justice and compassion, soul-shaking, mind-numbing, gut-wrenching questions surge forth. I have been trying in recent years to name them and pursue them. Consider two. One, what forms might climate reparations take? And two, what approach to religious ethics for climate-privileged people is capable of meeting the raging moral problem of climate debt? Well, we cannot pursue either of these questions here in a 15-minute talk, but pointing out viable directions for at least one is possible, and hopefully we'll bring up more in the question and answer session. Consider the second question, an approach to religious ethics capable of addressing the climate crisis as climate debt. This is the concern of my book, Resisting Structural Evil. It elaborates a framework for an ethic of love as an ecological and economic vocation, rather than only an interpersonal vocation. Two foci of that ethic, and two foci of any ethic adequate to the challenge of race-based and class-based climate debt. Two foci are morally empowering seeing and moral spiritual agency. Reflect with me on these two facets of morality. Ethics commonly is seen as a normative discipline, responding to the question of what ought we do and be. Two dynamics of the climate crisis, that is, two dynamics, the blinders of climate privilege and the ease of moral inertia. These two factors render the normative task alone as inadequate, calling forth the descriptive task, what I refer to as a transformative task of ethics. Here, I can see the deep resonance between the womanist ethic that Dr. Valerie Miles-Tribble outlined and this ethic capable of meeting the crisis of climate debt. She also calls forth the descriptive task. It's the first task in ethics. Said differently, in addition to its normative function, ethics must also first enable seeing what is going on in order to take moral responsibility for it. And in particular, demystifying what is hidden from view by the blinders of privilege. That is the descriptive task. Second, ethics must ignite and sustain moral agency and hope for radical change toward a more socially just and ecologically sustainable future. That is the transformative task. Here again, we hear resonance with Dr. Miles-Tribble's arc, the way she describes the arc of justice. I cannot overstate the crucial nature of both of these tasks held together. The survival of civilization in a relatively humane form may depend upon them. The two, the descriptive and the transformative, must be held together because the former, seeing climate change clearly, is a fast and sure way to disable the latter, moral agency and hope. We need then an ethics for climate justice that is capable of naming reality for what it is, and in spite of that, instilling hope and moral agency. This is the charge to religious ethics and to all people of goodwill at this point in human history. Here I have very little time, so I want to note simply this. In order to see more clearly what is going on, the descriptive task, we must understand why we so easily fail to see what is going on. In previous work, I have dissected moral oblivion, naming its components and possible paths to overcoming them. Here, I would note just 5 barriers to seeing what is going on more clearly as we carry on with public policies, corporate and institutional practices, and lifestyles that spew deadly amounts of greenhouse gases into the air. I refer to these barriers as blinders of climate privilege. We note quickly 5. 1, seeing would mandate radical changes in how we live and in public policy and corporate practices. Not seeing permits carrying on with the way things are. 2, a privatized sense of morality, so prevalent in the privatized ethos of dominant US culture, especially under neoliberalism. A privatized sense of morality obscures the moral dimension of our roles in social systems and obscures the importance of engagement in social movements. So the privatized sense of morality is the second factor in moral oblivion. 3rd, we may flee from seeing because we flee from the shame and guilt and sense of impotence that seeing would evoke. We cannot bear to see ourselves as so bad as destroying Earth's climate for sustaining life. 4th, a sense of powerlessness creeps in when we dare to acknowledge the power of the fossil fuel industry to influence public policy and sentiment, to shape our imaginations. And when we recognize the extent to which every action of life depends in some way, as it is now, on petroleum. A 5th factor in moral oblivion. For those of us who are white, whiteness feeds moral oblivion regarding climate change and its consequences. The links are many. As theologian David Gushee notes, white privilege can lead white people to assume subconsciously that things will work out for us. Many structures of Euro-Western society for at least 5 centuries have been set up to benefit white people, to make things work out while endangering others. Enculturation from birth by white supremacy provides a second link between whiteness and climate oblivion. White people are shaped by a deeply ingrained but utterly denied and unrecognized presupposition that white lives matter more than other lives, and the lives of moneyed people matter more than the lives of economically destitute people. Would Euro-Americans with money respond more urgently to the climate crisis if it were being experienced by white moneyed people as it is now experienced by Africans bearing the drought, or citizens of the Maldives preparing to be submerged by rising seas, or indigenous peoples in the US whose lands and waters have been destroyed by the fossil fuel industry? These then are 5 of the reasons that we fail to see clearly the climate violence of which we are so acutely a part. The limitations of this short 15-minute paper preclude addressing them, but I have done so elsewhere, and I challenge all of us to unpack these barriers to a moral response so that we may recognize more fully what is going on. Seeing more clearly enables recognizing climate change as climate debt and climate colonialism. And these open doors to the vitally important pursuit of climate reparations. Seeing more clearly what is going on is a necessary ingredient for responsible action. A second necessary ingredient is a sense of moral agency and hope. This may be the crucial role of religion. Indeed, one vital task of religion at this, the turning point in human history, is to call people into clearer vision, and then to plumb the depths of our religious traditions for wellsprings of hope and of moral spiritual agency to face the unfaceable with courage and wisdom and moral spiritual power. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. I can't think of a better point to land on, beginning with presentations that dealt with the future and we're very broad, and you've grounded us in a critical juncture and moment in a very useful way that I think will frame the conversation we can have now. We have approximately 20 minutes or so for a general engagement with all our panelists. We have some questions in the Q&A. Before we go to those and open it up to the larger participants who are chiming in from around the globe, Dr. Sherma and I would like to begin by asking 2 brief statements and questions for our panelists to engage with. Rita, would you like to begin with yours, or should I pose mine? Okay.
I have so many. I have to be mindful of time. The first one, Devin, is a comment on your wonderful paper and the concept you brought in of play. That struck me and stunned me, because I'm in the midst of writing the chapter in my book on this concept of the Sanskrit word for play, which is lila. Lila literally means, it refers to the play of the cosmos. If you want to look at it from a religious point of view, the play of the divine, or the play of ultimate reality, that there is a playful teleology that weaves itself through the entire ontological fabric of existence, and that the joy of the divine, the joy of the ground of existence, if you're not a religious person, is explodes in these songbirds with those beautiful stripes, and even in the marshy grasses that keep us safe from storms. And in all these things, it is the divine play, or the play of ultimate reality. So I just wanted to give you a note of appreciation on that. It was wonderful to hear. Whitney, CPR, I love it. I'm married to a cardiologist, so when I hear that, my antennas go up right away. But in this case, in a good way. I I fully agree with you. And when I have stated it, that this is critical, as someone whose heritage is an indigenous tradition, my eco-spiritual scholarship on my 4 millennia-old tradition it often encounters a critique when I speak, about these things, about the need for this kind of approach, attitude, what I call the reciprocity of reverence. And I'm told I'm romanticizing the natural world, which is sort of what a question that you received in the question box says, which is for you. And it says, I don't see a sense of urgency in the romanticism part of CPR. How can this part of the term grant a sense of urgency for planetary justice? Since I'm so used to hearing that, I want to now dump it on your lap because I'm tired of answering it. So please go ahead.
Well, I imagine other people on the panel have something to say too, but there, part of my answer is that I would sort of turn that on its head, right? So Andreas Weber, who's another German sort of romantic nature writer scientist also, he says, one way we can look at the Enlightenment in many ways, but one of them is that it's a constant reduction of empathy, right? And so it's the constant, like, keep your feelings like closer and closer in and don't extend them out into the rest of the natural world. And that it's a cutting off, right? And so why, to me, that's the problem, right? It's the reduction of feeling is the problem, and not this idea that you have feelings, and not this idea that we might be something like the other life that we evolved from, on the one hand. And then, yeah, I mean, that's what I'll say about the romantic part. The urgency part's a little bit different, but I want to let other people speak too.
If I could just jump in there, because I know that Whitney's heard me rant about this, I think, at least if memory serves, that, I mean, I sort of joke that academics are about the only people on earth that can turn love into a dirty word. And, I love the CPR thing, Whitney, because there's the critical part of it, because we need to be self-conscious about all of the ambiguities and the pathologies and the fraught nature of our history as people on this planet, right? So, yeah, but that doesn't mean that we should turn romance into a bad word. It seems to me that if we're going to have any chance of creating a sustainable world and being uppity about that, that falling in love with the living world is a part of that, which is why I've been focused for, gosh, as long as I've really been an activist in this kind of work, and why I've been drawn to environmental movements and indigenous cultures for whom kinship is a long-standing thing, not something that's a new materialism. So for those of us who are old, I'm sure John, sometimes, you're always so kind, John, but my hunch is that sometimes you've felt, well, what's new about the new materialism and interspecies ethnography and all these new fields that are coming to a kind of animistic or quasi-animistic spirituality are awakening to the liveliness of the world. And I think that's great, but it also just kind of bemuses me that they think that they're the ones that are discovering this, where this is a part of the emotional and cognitive repertoire of our species, and it has been since we've been human.
Bron, I want to just bring up the concept of Wilson and Kellert's biophilia hypothesis. I've long been a fan of this concept and have used it in my work. And when you brought it up, it's really interesting, because what it really tells us is that we evolved cognitively and in many other ways in our encounter and in deep interrelationship with wildness. And because we are so massively removed at this point from that through which we evolved and with which we have been in interrelationship until very, very recently, not even 100 years. What what can that do to our cognitive processes and to our, to our growth as a species and to our ability to be healthy on a, on a level of emotion, psychology, cognitivity, and so forth. I think that if we don't learn to be, as you said, fall in love with the world, with the wildness, we are really in a state of biophobia. And that is pathological. So I wanted to thank you for bringing that up. John, the Indigenous narratives, just so important right now. I wanted to ask you a question about that, the lifeway narratives. The Mesoamerican concept of cosmovision, the Mesoamerican concept of cosmovision, it is reflected not only in their cosmologies and ontologies, but in their epistemologies. And I think one of the tasks that Latin American decoloniality scholars think of when they're dealing with this is the idea of epistemic reclamation, the idea of the pluriverse. And I wondered if there's any kind of distinction between the ways, in your experience, that Latin American, Mesoamerican, and contemporary Latin American thinkers see cosmovision and the way that North American Indigenous people see their lifeway narratives. Is there a distinction? Is there a subtle distinction? Because, it would be very interesting to add to the richness.
Yeah. Thanks, Rita. I'm not able to speak of the overt distinctions in the North American and Mesoamerican, because I've been so taken of late between these discussions of the meeting of Indigenous elders and their joint understanding that cosmovisions, for example, acknowledging the four stoppings of the sun, or what we would say quarters, or the sense of relationships between the eagle and the condor. And so the alliance building is uppermost in my mind. I'm also reaching back to both the Whitney and Bron's remarks too, and I'm seeing them in terms of Valerie's emphasizing the arc of justice and how it bends. And so the bending of these cosmovisions is what strikes me too, Rita, is the way in which, say, Winona LaDuke is now in northern Minnesota, literally teaching young people how to stand up in their resistance to this pipeline number 3, and to transmit to them a deeper understanding of who they are as people on this earth. To me, it's a bending of the cosmovision, and it's Whitney's romance too. She's not above opening these young people to an intense affective relationship with the work that they're doing. And that's a bending in this arc of justice. And so I wish I could go to your question more directly, Rita, because it's a very good one. And there's some very fine scholars exploring these relationships.
Can I just pop in there and say that? Can I just add that I think that effective piece is really important, because it goes, I think it ties in with what Valerie's saying, what Cynthia was saying, that it's not just, we do see the problems around us, and I know that Cynthia knows this too, but we do see the problems and we do know stuff, but it's the effective and habitual stuff, right? That needs shifting. I think because we're so caught in the habits and desires and hopes and dreams of this fossil fueled reality, right? And sort of modernity, and it's the effective things, the things that are subconscious and subrational that really need the shifting. And so I think that what you just said about sort of having them, experience feelings for what they're doing, I think that's like a crucial piece to all of this.
Mm.
The last very brief thing I want to say is I want to thank Valerie and Cynthia for their work in this area. And to Cynthia, I just want to say one thing, that this well springs of love that you speak about, the well springs of hope, the well springs of hope within religious traditions that we can bring to the fore, I call them internal resources. And there's a lot of pushback for our work, as that the hermeneutics of suspicion continues to corrode the belief, the conviction that these traditions have lasted so long, not only because they're so terrible, but because they actually have incredible resources for flourishing.
Yeah, that, Rita, is such an important point. It is, it really, it's interesting in his book, Amitav Ghosh, the Indian essayist, his book, The Great Derangement. He's not a religious person. And you read his whole book, there's no reference to religion. It's about the derangement of the human species that has enabled, allowed climate change to go on. And at the end, I think it's page 159 or something, towards the end of the book, he says that one of his great hopes lies in religion. Yeah. And you want to go, why? He hasn't mentioned religion. He's not a religious figure. Why is religion the great hope? And he names some things. And one of the things he names is the capacity of religion to pull people out of self-interest alone, be it individual self-interest or tribal or national, but to serve a broader vision, a greater good. And that is indeed maybe one of the great gifts that religion brings. And as I have probed religious traditions of which I am a part, and so those are limited to Christianities, but the sources of hope in the midst of the unbearable are profound in Christianities and in other traditions. I mean, the symbol of cross and resurrection, that in the most brutal of human brokenness, by imperial power, the force that can redeem the universe and is creating it is present with us. And that while the transformative power of the universe resides within the created world. So that's a claim of many Christian traditions. The power of justice-seeking love that comes into the world with Judaism, that the power of naming justice-seeking as an integral dimension of love, and then that force is flowing and pouring through all things. That's a quote from Martin Luther, even the tiniest leaf. That is an amazing source of moral spiritual power. So I guess I really do, I think there's never been a time when religions are called more deeply to drink from their well springs and bring them to the broader public.
Well said.
Thank you, Valerie. I mean, thank you, Cynthia. I'm so sorry. I can't think of a better answer to that question. And Valerie, I have one question for you, and it's a personal question in a way, because I have to deal with this and I'm not sure how to do that. So the question becomes the idea of epistemic injustice, is what I call it, that the experiences, the lived knowledge systems of people of the global South, of Black Americans, Indigenous peoples, minorities, and those who colonized places, previously colonized places, that somehow everything that they have experienced and known over time through their embodied being is not legitimate until modern science can prove it. And modern science has absolutely no good reason to try to do so. So how do we how do we reclaim when what we are reclaiming is not even considered valid means of knowing?
Excellent question. I think I have two thoughts on that. First of all, part of the deconstruction that I mentioned and the demythologizing that Cynthia mentioned is what is needed. And I think more and more in this new vein of, or not new, but in this increasingly vocal, visible vein of scholarship that is forthcoming from womanist feminist traditions on eco-justice and on indigenous spirituality, is one that sort of pulls back the veil and reveals some things, such as a very profound thing that at the crux of our pharmaceutical industry has been scientists and corporate persons going to those indigenous places, residing for a time with the indigenous peoples, learning the folk medicines and the plant knowledge and formulating it, bringing it back and formulating it into prescriptions, where you find that the Maori people in New Zealand, and you find that people in South America, and you find that people all over Africa have been using those remedies as part of their Ubuntu existence with Mother Earth, but it becomes packaged and capitalized such that they then can look back and say, oh, those folk traditions are not valid, when in fact that was where it came from, the root of it, if not to offer a turn of phrase. The second thing I think that we are seeing, and particularly with a few of my advisees, and I'm encouraging their interest in recapturing this indigenous moral biography, going back and inviting peoples and generations to proclaim their stories that have been subliminated under larger narratives. And in so doing, pulling forth the wisdom of the ancestors, pulling forth this theoethics, pulling forth this moral spirituality, this eco-justice sensibility that has resided, I think, as John spoke about and as others spoke about, in the lived experiences of the people all along. But we, in our desire to expand Christianity, for example, or in the missiological moves, we told those indigenous people that those beliefs, practices, oneness with the earth was not valid, that they somehow had to move into this Christological decentering of themselves. And I like that this younger generation of scholars are using, as Cynthia said, and you said, this hermeneutic of suspicion and decentering that hegemonic notion and bringing back up the groundswell of the indigenous belief systems, voices, spiritualities, and putting them right beside Christianity to show that, like the capitalist efforts, Christianity has adapted some of those very indigenous practices and ethos and beliefs, and yet now it becomes something else. So I didn't mention it because I thought Cynthia would, but one of the very classic examples of a friend and colleague, Dr. Melanie Harris, is her small but powerful book on eco-womanism that is another example of the kind of scholarship coming up that blends the theologies with the earth honoring faiths and traditions.
Excellent. Thanks, Valerie. I'm afraid we have run out of time. We don't have space for more questions in this first plenary session, but we would encourage everyone who's attended to return at 1:30. We will resume the symposium for the day with a panel on eco-spirituality and eco-psychology, which promises to be equally arresting and provocative. So please come back, and I want to thank everyone on this panel for your time and your attention. It's been really wonderful to think about the future and also our present ground, where we stand together as a community of academics invested in these critical questions in a time of climate change.